Well, of course, this is our National Mother's Day, and I'm reminded of an old Spanish proverb. An ounce of mother is better than a pound of clergy. Now, recognizing that most of the hard work in our parish is done by our mothers, I hope to give you a little less than a pound of clergy today. The gospel today is simple and it's hard. It's simple because its command is so easy to understand. We're commanded to love. And it's hard because in our human nature, it is much easier to hate, to ridicule, and to gossip than to love. And I want to look at the gospel today through the life of an Englishwoman who lived in the last century and was a popular religious writer, an artist, a poet, and a mystic. And her name was Carol Houselander. Her life encompassed both World War I and World War II. She was born in 1901 and died in 1954 of breast cancer at only 53 years of age. Carol had three mystical visions growing up that shaped her life and shaped her beliefs. And I'm going to tell you about two of those mystical visions. I'm going to leave one because I want you to go and read her books and you can find out what her second vision was. But her first vision, as a young child, she and her sister Ruth were sent to a Catholic boarding school. It was called the Convent of the Holy Cross, and it was common in England to send your children to boarding schools. And it was run by a community of French nuns. But within the community was one German nun who spoke very little English, and she was isolated from her family and her friends in Germany. And of course, after World War I began, the Germans were hated by the English, and it made her life very difficult. Carol Houselander recalled coming upon her in the boot room where she was polishing shoes, and tears were running down her face. Carol noticed that her hands were folded in a way that expressed inconsolable grief. And here's what she stated. We were both quite silent, and I stared down at her beautiful hands, afraid to look up. And then I saw the nun crowned with a crown of thorns. I shall not attempt to explain this. I'm simply telling the thing as I saw it. That bowed head was weighed under the crown of thorns. I stood for, I suppose, a few seconds, dumbfounded. And then, finding my tongue, I said to her, I would not cry if I was wearing the crown of thorns like you are. She looked at me as if she were startled and asked, what do you mean? And I said, I don't know. And at the time, I did not. I sat down beside her, and together we polished the shoes. Now, of course, later in her life, she realized the meaning of this vision, that Christ, our suffering Christ, is present in each and every one of us in our sufferings. The next vision I'm going to talk about she had when she was a young woman and she was working. She was traveling from work on the London Underground train. I think it's called the Tube these days. And it was at rush hour, and it was crowded with every type of person returning from work back to their homes. And she says, quite suddenly I saw with my mind, but as vividly as a wonderful picture, Christ in them all. But I saw more than that. Not only was Christ in every one of them, living in them, dying in them, rejoicing in them, sorrowing in them, but because he was in them and because they were here, the whole world was here in this underground train. Not only the world as it was at that moment, not only at the people and the countries of the world, but all those who had lived before and all those yet to come. I came out on the street and walked for a long time in the crowds. It was the same here on every side and every passerby, Christ. Now, these visions shaped her life. She believed that Christ was in all persons, in every kind of person, and is in many different ways as there are different persons. As we hear in the Acts of the Apostles today, Everyone who fears God in any nation is a child of God. And the Spirit falls both on the Gentiles and on the Jews. In 1941, Carol wrote a book called The Reed of God. It is a spiritual classic. It's a book about Mary. Mary as mother of Christ, and Mary as mother of the church. And in talking about Our Lady, Carol notes that the one thing Mary did, and the one thing that we all have to do, is to bear Christ into the world. This is a task for both men and for women. And it's about how we give birth to Christ in ourselves and bring him into the world. That is the subject matter of her book, The Reed of God. And she believed that the key to mothering Christ into ourselves is what she calls virginal emptiness, an original emptiness that we are all born with. Now, we all fill this emptiness with the wrong things, whether it's money or glory or something else. She encourages us to embrace this emptiness because it is an emptiness with a purpose. And like any poet, she explains it in terms of metaphors and comparisons. The emptiness she is talking about is like the emptiness and the hollowness of a reed, a hollowness that can be made into a musical instrument. She says we are like that hollow reed, that if we let it, if we empty ourselves of our trivial concerns and all the habits and pursuits that distract us, the divine life can blow breath through us and make the music that we are created to be. She says the emptiness is like a cup shaped to receive water, which if we allow it to be entered into by Christ, can be turned into wine. And she says the emptiness is like a bird's nest, built to receive a little one, a nest within ourselves for Christ, who begins life in us as small as a mustard seed, but grows each day. The whole point of this emptiness is to make room for something else. She writes, we're all asked if we will surrender what we are, our humanity, our flesh and blood, to the Holy Spirit, and allow Christ to fill the emptiness formed by the particular shape of our lives. In her life, Carol, perhaps based on the hardships, difficulties, and sufferings that she had, became very adept at assisting people, both children and adults, who had psychological imbalances. Dr. Eric Strauss, who became the president of the British Psychological Society, learned of her abilities and sent her 2 young children that no other psychologist had had any luck with. Many years later, someone inquired of Dr. Strauss about Carol's success with these children when all others failed. He said, she loved them back to life. The life and story of Carol Houselander says all that needs to be said about our gospel today. Like Mary, we have to live the command of love. Like Mary, we need to empty ourselves and make space for Christ as a mother does. And we need to nurture the living Christ within ourselves and bring Christ into the world. And if we can capture this love, we will see the Christ in every other human being we meet. This month, my mother will be 95 years old. And of course, time has worn her away in many ways. In the last few years, time has emptied out many of her memories and hollowed out some of the favorite stories she used to like to tell. But when I see my mother, and I see the brightness in her eye, and I see the smile on her face, I see the divine life of Christ flowing through her emptiness and coming into me. Our mothers give us life, and they bring us back to life through love.